Welcome to the course MSD 014. Session is going to deal with policy instruments for pollution control, conservation and clean energy. Now, pollution is the introduction of, as you know, various contaminants in an ecosystem that may cause damage, instability, disorder, harm or discomfort to the ecosystem components, that is especially physical systems or also living organisms that act as impediments to achieve sustainable development. Now, what happens with increasing accumulation of toxic and non-recyclable or slowly recyclable waste represents high entropy and may lead to gradual increase in intergenerational inequity. We have to understand that without pollution control, waste products from consumption, heating, agriculture, mining, manufacturing, transportation and other human activities, whether they accumulate or disperse, degrade the environment and hamper economic development process. It is also important to develop and implement some policy instruments to reduce pollution and environmental damage based on polluter pay principle and other pollution control measures to achieve the goals of sustainable development. Now, there are several instruments that are devised by different policy makers across the world over the time to deal with environmental pollution issues, and most of these instruments are ranging from moral suasion to imprisonment. Now, under the polluter pay principle, polluters are made to pay in the form of taxes to compensate the negative externalities from their activities. Now, the very broad policy instrument to control and regulate pollution are, most importantly, decentralized policy instruments, market-based instruments, and command and control-based instruments. Some of the popular and widely used pollution control instruments include regulation of emission. Now, how they regulate emissions? There are diverse ways to do that. They range from designing standards, taxing emissions, taxing products which add pollutants before and after use, issue of pollution permits, incentivizing polluters to abate, labeling products, creating awareness among the users, and also imposing deposit refund system or polluting impacts, and so on and so forth. Now, if we have a look to the historical development of these policy instruments, we get to know that from the very beginning of modern environmental policy making started sometime in early 70s, and this started in United States of America. The first National Environmental Policy Act, or also called as NEPA, was signed by the US President Richard Nixon in January 1st, 1970. At that time, environment policy was a bipartisan issue, and the efforts of United States of America actually helped countries around the world to make proper environmental policies and programs to reduce environmental pollution. Now, during this period, a legislation was passed to regulate pollutants that go into the air, water tables, solid waste disposal across the country in USA. Since 1970, now we know it has been almost 50 years, the government of various countries have started adopting the different legislation to reduce environmental pollution and also degradation. All the policy instruments for protecting and sustaining ecological resources have a very common goal, and this common goal is to achieve ecological improvements that includes reduction in carbon dioxide emissions and other GHGs. This avoids negative and create positive impacts in other areas of the society. We have to understand that policy instruments that attain sustainable management and help in attaining sustainable management of ecological resources are basically classified into three groups. The first one is decentralized. Now, this is a moral suasion. Second is command and control. This is direct regulation, such as ambient, influent or technology standards that are combined with enforcement. And the third one, market-based instruments such as emission tax, subsidies, and also tradable permits. Now, when I talk about decentralized policy instruments, there are certain things to keep in mind. Moral suasion is persuasion exerted or acted through and upon the moral nature or sense, and it basically aims to manipulate the cultural environment. This means that this approach is considered as one of the most important means adopted by various environmental authorities across the world in different countries to reduce environmental degradation and depletion of resources. Even our Environmental Protection Authority, Ministry of Environment and Forest and Climate Change, often exert pressure by issuing orders without resorting to legal action in an attempt to get firms and individuals behave in a way that serves the policy or regulating pollution. It also involves attempts to change the preferences of economic agents without adopting command and control measures and without directly changing price and incentive structure. Now here is the important context, and that says that the most important objective of moral suasion is providing information about the ecological consequences because of increasing anthropogenic pressure. And there are diverse examples of this moral suasion as an environmental policy instrument, and these are financing the campaigns to raise public awareness, product labeling requirements, voluntary agreements by the polluters or emission targets, subsidization of research and development for alternative eco-friendly technologies, and financing the basic research. Now, if I talk this entire approach and instrument with a neoclassical economist perspective, we get to know that they were really dismissive of moral suasion approach, and they said this is basically a reflection of the assumption of given preferences and consumer sovereignty. Moral suasion approach to change preference of the consumer and firms and government pertaining to environmental sustainability assumes a significant place in our democratic society. Now to the next regulation, that's called as command and control regulation. Command and control regulation or command and control instruments are basically direct form of regulation. These instruments have been the dominant method of environmental regulation across most of the countries. Now, while framing the early environmental policies of 1970s to reduce pollution and environmental degradation, policymakers instituted standard-based system. Now, keeping in mind the prevailing legal traditions of dealing with the activities deemed excessive by the society. Command and control pattern of regulation sets a uniform target for how much firms should emit by dictating the production process that should be carried out in their facilities. Broadly, there are two types of command and control regulations. The first is technology-based and second, performance-based. Now, these regulations set the standards which can be emission-based, they can also be product-based, they are ambient-based, and also these are technology-based. Now, they are mostly used for pollution control and sustainable management of common property resources. These instruments, which are currently in use, operate at actually different stages of production in pollution generation process, and these include input used, production technique, emission output, location of emission, and ambient pollution levels. Now, a emission-based standard puts up a regulation in form of non-emitting form, then X units of pollution. For example, carbon dioxide, SOx, sulfur dioxides, per unit of fuel or per unit of time. So, that is in per unit of output. So, in general, these measures are not cost efficient because they tend to be applied uniformly across the polluters, and making emission reduction targets the same across polluters may lead to inefficient outcomes. So, command and control regulation should state that emissions should be actually low as a reasonably achievable target. Now, examples of direct regulation in India are many. That includes control and abatement of air pollution. For example, Air Act 1982, then 1987, Prevention and Control of Water Pollution, the Water Act. Then there are standards for hazardous waste disposal that are under Hazardous Waste Rules 1989, and restrictions on the dangerous substances that include the manufacture, storage and import of hazardous chemical rules, that is under 1989. So under direct regulation, a government can ban substances or production techniques if they deem to be dangerous for human well-being and as well as natural resources. Now, some environmental economists consider command and control approach as economically inefficient because overall compliance costs are not minimized, and dynamically inefficient once the standard is achieved. The polluter has no incentive to basically go further. But in case of zero emission option or ambient concentration, this command and control instrument are most preferred options. Then what is the best policy? The best policy is to put a complete ban on pollutant, as has happened in case of many pesticides which are very dangerous for sustainable development. For example, DDT or 2,4-D, where ban has been imposed. Now the third one is an important policy instrument is a market-based instrument, also called as MBIs. So as we know that ecological resources are public goods and these are not exchanged in conventional markets. Therefore, no price emerges to indicate relative scarcity of these resources such as air, water and forest. Now economic activities generate pollution that leads to cost to others, that is called as externalities, and we have discussed this approach in previous sessions. In order to understand the logic of adoption of economic instruments to reduce pollution, one has to understand why pollution rises. Now economists consider pollution as a market failure which arises because of the polluters and because of the development. The underlying premise for market-based instrument is basically to correct this market failure by placing a cost on the release of pollutants and the contaminated items. These instruments are designed in such a way that they can internalize the externalities into decision-making process by putting up a charge, fee or tax on every unit of effluent and contaminated polluted released in the water, in the river, influences the manufacturer's decision regarding how much he will produce and how much he can produce. Now the manufacturer must minimize total production cost that consists not only of labor, material, machinery and energy input, but also of the effluent output. It is sometimes evident that due to higher pollution charges or taxing, the manufacturer decides to modify and alter the core production process by installing latest technologies or working with new materials which reduce the waste generation and pollutants. Now what are the common type of MBIs? The common MBIs are taxes or charges, fees or other environmental additional prices to be paid by the polluters for the social cost that is arising from the pollution, which is then refundable. The second one is subsidies that are provided to induce the individuals to alter or comply with the environmental standards stipulated by a regulatory authority. Now third one is deposit, refund or a rebate system, where a surcharge is put on the price of a product leading to an environmental resource depletion or also pollution, which can be then refunded if the product is recycled or depleted resources are restored or regenerated. Now there are tradable permits, emission trading, which is used as a right to discharge pollution or exploit resources that can be exchanged either through a fee or a control permit market by creating enabling institutions, for example, green banks, water banks, etc. Now, example of these permits include carbon trading also, because through tradable permits for GHG emissions, marketable quotas for fish harvesting, tradable depletion rights for mineral and water use, and marketable discharge permits for waterborne effluents and pollutants. Now, these marketable instruments offer a very dynamic incentive and can help to ensure that a given target is met if combined with an appropriate allocation of emission allowances. Now, there is another approach that is called as compensatory incentive for conservation of environmental resources. Now, this is very similar to subsidies in the market or financial instruments or inducements which are created for certain individuals who bear the cost of environmental improvement or who possess unique environmental resources. Now, talking about market-based instruments, and especially in developing countries, we know that as we discussed about market-based instruments, they are widely used across in different developed countries and are found to be very effective in reducing pollution and improving the quality of environment in the countries. But when the question is about how relevant these instruments have been for developing countries, the experience of developing countries in implementing these market-based instruments has been a very poor and has also proved not to be a very effective approach in reducing pollution and enhancing the quality of environment. The reason could be lack of adequate enforcement mechanism. It can also be because of the popularity of implementing MBIs is gaining strength among the fast-growing economies like South Korea, Malaysia, and also Chile. The reason of slow growth of and slow progress of MBI implementation in developing countries like India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Pakistan, and other countries can be attributed to the problem of asymmetric and improper information and also corruption. Now, regulators need to know less about the magnitude of pollution, and this is also the case that regulators are in these countries knowing not much about the magnitude of the problem of pollution and the polluters. Despite that, there are still some good examples to be shared for MBIs that are in practice in developing countries and economies which are now undergoing transition phase in last couple of years. It is also evident that there are charges for exceeding emission limits in Korea and China, but these incentives are generally very weak due to the charge level being very low and with no incentive for polluter to adjust technologies or output. There are effluent changes in the palm oil industry in Malaysia, and the deposit refund schemes in Korea and Taiwan are the example of market-based instruments in reducing pollution and enhancing the program for environmental conservation. Now, tradable water rights are very popular in Chile, and the market for water is growing at a very fast rate. And the concept of water bank is also gaining a lot of momentum at the moment in United States of America to reduce water pollution and conserve water resources. Now, coming to the end of this discussion of this session on policy instrument, would like to summarize what we discussed today. Now, one thing is very important, and it is very essential to develop and implement policy instruments to reduce pollution and environmental damage based on polluter pay principle and other pollution control measures to achieve the goals of sustainable development. Now, under the polluter pay principle, polluters are made to pay in the form of taxes to compensate the negative externalities from their activities. So, the broad policy instrument to control and regulate pollution are decentralized policy instruments. So, these are market-based instruments and command and control instruments as we discussed. Popular pollution control instruments include regulation of emission by designing standards, taxing emissions, taxing products which add pollutants before and after use. Now, issue of pollution permits, incentivizing polluters to abate, labeling products, creating awareness among the users, imposing deposit refund schemes on polluting principles products are some of the examples. Now, moral suasion is a persuasion exerted upon and through the moral nature or sense. This is considered as one of the important means adopted by various environmental regulatory authorities of different countries of the world, and this helps to reduce environmental degradation and depletion. Now, command and control measures through the use of emission limit value and environmental quality standard are a key aspect of environmental legislation, and this keeps to ensure and helps to ensure that emissions fall and that the quality of the environment is respected. So common type of MBIs are basically taxes or charges, fees or other additional prices to be paid by the polluters for the social cost arising from environmental damage. There are subsidies provided to induce the individual to alter or comply with the environmental standard that is stipulated by the regulatory authority. So this includes deposits, refunds, rebate, systems which are a surcharge and are put on the price of a product, leading to environmental resource depletion or pollution, which is then refunded if the product is recycled or depleted resource is restored back or regenerated. Now there are other approaches like tradable permits, emission trading, that are used for trading and where rights to discharge pollution or exploit resources can be exchanged either through a fee control or a control permit based on market by creating an enabling environment such as green banks, water banks, etc. Now, compensatory incentives for conservation are very relevant in environmental resource conservation. There are also voluntary schemes like environmental management system or voluntary agreement that can be very useful in optimal and optional route to capacity building progress in selected areas, and thus this can help to contribute for a move towards shared responsibility. With this, we come to the end of this session. I'm sure that you have learned something about policy instrument and how this can help in environmental management, conservation of resources, and developing cleaner technologies. This will be relevant to understand more on how present world is moving and what kind of policy instruments are there to ensure sustainable management of resources around us. Thank you so much.